As my tired legs pumped the pedals of my trusty two-wheel steed along the dusty Yahatinda road, my eyes were drawn to the inky blackness of the silent sky above. A myriad of stars twinkled and shone overhead. The Big Dipper looked close enough for me to reach out and take hold of its handle and bring it even closer. I was feeling the effects of another long day on the eastern border of Banff National Park, but it wasn't sore muscles and dehydration that were on my mind. I was thinking how darn lucky I was to be out here with a healthy body and mind, able to have an experience like this in perfect mid-October conditions. Barrier Mountain and Mount Gable sit on the eastern edge of Banff National Park against the southwest corner of the Upper Clearwater Ram Plews and Yahatinda Ranch, and the northwest corner of the Panther Corners public land use zone. Sarah McLean and I made the familiar bike ride through the Tinda Ranch from the Bighorn parking lot on a perfect fall day in mid-October 2022, leaving our bikes at the Banff border before continuing on foot up the Red Deer River. After crossing the river, we hiked up the approach canyon on a series of animal trails, ledges, and tight access points before ascending steep rubble leading to a southwest ridge descending off a false summit of Barrier. From the ridge, we traversed horrible scree to the northwest ridge of the main summit. A short crux wall led to our first summit of the day. From the summit of Barrier, we retraced our route to the southwest ridge of the Outlier before taking a scenic high-level traverse to the summit of Mount Gable. From the summit of Mount Gable, we descended moderate terrain on north and northeast ridges towards the approach canyon far below. The long exit down the northwest drainage went quick, but darkness was settling in as we finally recrossed the Red Deer River and started hiking back towards our bikes. After a 14-kilometer bike ride in the dark, we completed a fantastic day in the hills. It took us 14 hours and around 51 kilometers with over 2,200 meters of height gain to combine these two peaks into a wonderful day trip from Calgary. As the last of an endless series of perfect weather and conditions weekends loomed large in mid-October, I found myself planning a set of peaks that require a very special set of conditions to be done effectively. Barrier and Gable Mountain have been on my list for at least 7 years since I scrambled Warden Rock with Stephen and Ben back in 2015. I recruited Sarah to join me on this adventure, and despite having huge doubts we'd get both done, I warned her that I was hoping to get both Barrier and Gable done in one day, despite shorter daylight hours and stats working against this silly idea. She agreed to it, which is why I like doing trips with her. We left the Bighorn parking lot at 0700 in the dark. Despite this being my 10th or more time biking the Tinda Road, it was Sarah's first. A new gate with brand new signs greeted us along the way, but thankfully it didn't prohibit bikes along the Tinda Road. We stashed our bikes at the Banff Bison Gate and continued up trail on foot as morning broke slowly around us. We hiked only about 1 kilometer on the road before cutting off towards the northwest access canyon between Warden Rock and Gable across the Red Deer River. Our crossing point on the Red Deer River was only knee-deep on the close side, but as we continued to wade across, it quickly deepened until it was crotch deep. From the river crossing, we walked up a dry creek bed before veering left to an obvious trail running up the northeast side of the drainage. It didn't take long before the creek bed narrowed into a very steep and winding canyon that necessitated a steep ascent on its northeast banks. After ascending the northeast bank, we traversed steep, loose slopes back into the canyon. Traversing steep and horribly loose slopes would become a theme on this trip. Once back in the creek bed, the hike up the canyon was some pretty special stuff. There were fossils and interesting landscape features all along the route. Sometimes creek parkour can be an endless and tiring affair, but this was way too much fun and way too scenic for that. That was more like when you get your 3-year-old to do something and they're like, eh.
Yeah, and this one can try yet to skip.
Okay.
It won't. This one's...
Where the creek narrowed into steep, dried-out waterfalls, I found easy bypasses while Sarah practiced her climbing skills, tackling most of them head-on without issue. Within only 90 minutes from the bike drop, we were already passing Cornelius's campsite location and the ascent line for Mount Gable. We were greatly encouraged that a shot at both Barrier and Gable might be more realistic than we first thought. We continued traveling up a very scenic alpine valley before starting a scree grind to the southwest ridge descending off a false summit of barrier. Despite the slope looking horrid from afar, it was frozen in place, making for a fairly easy ascent. In a constant theme for this trip, everything was further, looser, and bigger than it first appeared, and this included a traverse of rubble slopes along the southwest face of a prominent summit northwest of Barrier Mountain. Finally, we neared the end of the interminable slog and found ourselves in the northwest ridge of Barrier Mountain, looking up at the summit block ahead. Despite the crux wall looking pretty fierce at first, Sarah danced up it like it was nothing but a casual hike. By 12:30, only 5.5 hours into our day, we found ourselves on the summit of Barrier Mountain with some of the cleanest air I've been in all year. At this point, for various reasons, I was slowly warming to the idea of a high-level traverse from Barrier to Gable, rather than descending all the way back to Cornelius' ascent line from Canyon Bottom. From the summit of Barrier Mountain, the ridge traverse to Mount Gable looked very doable. Sarah and I agreed that it was definitely worth a shot. It was interesting to see the prescribed Dormer Valley burn still smoking away. It was actually growing bigger again due to the unusually dry October. Sarah made the descent of the crux look, once again, easy. It took me a bit to work out the one difficult move, but eventually I sorted it out and we continued down the northwest ridge and onto the horrible scree traverse under the northwest outlier. We retraced our steps past the top-out point from the northwest canyon, on towards the southwest trending line, to the east ridge of an outlier. Rather than ascend this lower outlier, we chose to traverse southeast rubble slopes, which looked fairly short and easy. Of course, it was neither short nor easy. It was another horribly loose affair. As we continued our traverse up the north ridge of the highest point, I noticed an easy-looking line from climbers left to right situated off the ridge to my left. Despite necessitating another rubble traverse, I decided to check it out, and Sarah chose to continue up the north ridge direct. The rubble traverse was short, and my chosen line was easy, ascending loose dinner plate to the southeast ridge under the summit, before offering an easy hike to the highest point. Sarah was already there, her route going at moderate to difficult scrambling depending on the exact line. It was now almost 3:30 in the afternoon, and we were realizing how much further everything was than it first appeared. We had to keep moving in order to beat sunset. The rest of the traverse to the summit of Mount Gable went about as good as these things can. There was no wind, and we were in t-shirts in mid-October, so it was very hard to be negative over the various undulations and loose traverses along the route. Finally, at around 1700 hours, a whopping 4.5 hours from the summit of Barrier Mountain, we were standing on our second peak of the day. Even now, I'm surprised it took us that long. I don't think we were moving that slow, but who knows with these things. I was positively psyched that we'd gotten both peaks, but now it was time to face the fact that we were very quickly losing daylight. I should have done a bit more research on routes, which would have given us the option of descending an easier and quicker route into the valley east of Gable, like Rick Collier did. Instead, we spent the next 90 minutes or so descending the same series of low cliffs and ridges that Cornelius and Richard used to valley bottom. We were moving about as quickly as we could, but the moderate north and northeast ridges felt like a long way down. After trending north, we cut down an east-northeast ridge leading to valley bottom, still far below at this point. This is where the crux on Gable is located if taking Cornelius's route. I strongly suspected there was an easier bypass, and left Sarah to downclimb the cliff band while I simply walked along rubble to my right before scrambling easy down a slab and rubble ramp through it all. From the crux cliff band, we descended scree before cutting back to the east-northeast ridge and descending varying degrees of rubble and scree to treeline and the northwest access drainage below. Phew! I don't know about Sarah, but I seriously underestimated how high Mount Gable was above the northwest drainage. We didn't have time to linger upon reaching the canyon. We were both dehydrated. We'd had no access to water for 9 hours since last passing this spot at 09:30 in the morning. Thankfully, we found a puddle and quenched some thirst before trying to beat total darkness to the Red Deer River. We didn't quite make that goal, but we did manage to finish exiting the main northwest drainage around the lowest choke point before night descended over the Red Deer River Valley. We followed our headlamps to the Red Deer River and crossed it before walking back to our bikes. The beam of my headlamp reflected the winding road in front of me and focused my mind on all the incredible adventures I've managed to experience in 2022. Our day came to an end 14 hours after it started, again in the dark at Bighorn Falls parking lot. What a day! I can't think of a more appropriate or better way to end the main 2022 summer season. This trip has it all and requires the exact set of circumstances that we used to complete it. A very highly recommended trip for parties that can move quickly through typical Rockies terrain with a light pack. Just make sure you're well hydrated before leaving that valley floor towards Barrier Mountain.